Hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting for the trial of the articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States.
Well, that was the beginning of the Senate's impeachment proceedings of then-President Bill Clinton. On January 14, 1999, President Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives on the grounds of perjury to a grand jury and obstruction of justice. He was later acquitted by the Senate, but how much did Mr. Clinton react publicly to the impeachment? Well, the New York Times writes Mr. Clinton concluded that he would fare better if he appeared to focus on the people's business and tried hard not to get caught up in each day's developments as the House moved to impeach him. Well, here to talk about the different approaches is Patrick Maney. I've been practicing that, Professor, all morning. He's the professor of history at Boston College and also the author of Bill Clinton, New Gilded Age President. So, Patrick, was President Clinton really able to get anything done while he was being impeached?
What's interesting is that the investigations into the Clinton presidency began during his first term, and he was angry and didn't hesitate to show his anger. And of course, Hillary Clinton sort of most famously called the investigations part of a vast right-wing conspiracy. Well, what's interesting is as soon as the official impeachment hearings began, Clinton was actually transformed. He kept all of his anger inside and devoted himself solely to the performance of his presidential duties. And in many ways, the period during impeachment and the trial in the Senate marked the high point of the Clinton presidency. His aides had never seen him quite as disciplined and as focused as he was during that period. And there were crises. There were crises in Sudan and Iraq and elsewhere. And Clinton dealt with them with great sort of courage and resoluteness, as he hadn't done before.
We see him there with Prime Minister Ehud Barak. When you talk about his focus, was he successful, though? Did that work, that strategy work for him in not talking about it publicly, but focusing on policy?
It absolutely worked. And the high point of this was his State of the Union message in January 1999, while the Senate trial was going on. And he appeared for an hour before senators and members of the House that were trying to get him out of office. And it was a tour de force. He never mentioned the trial or impeachment. And he was both humorous and gracious towards his opponents. And he presented a lot of substantial proposals as well. And that did it. At the end of the State of the Union message, even his most ardent foes, like televangelist Pat Robertson, said that opponents could, close up the operations, that Clinton was going to persevere. So there's a lesson in that, I think. This kind of laser-like focus on the presidency really allowed him to survive and to keep his approval ratings. People were not approving of his personal behavior, but his performance in office maintained a steady sort of 60% plus during the trial in the Senate.
You talk about his approval rating. One thing that 20 years later is hard to ignore, we're living in an age of social media. We know President Trump is very aggressive on social media. The cycle of turning around news is totally different from 20 years ago. So what's your assessment of how President Trump has navigated these waters for the investigation and the growing talk of impeachment?
Well, there is a parallel between what Clinton did during his first term, when he treated all the investigations into Whitewater and the supposed gates, Filegate and Travelgate and Troopergate, with scorn, so much scorn and dismissal outspokenly that even some of Clinton's defenders thought, that he might have been, they suspected that there might be something to them because he was so overt in his defense and his opposition. So I think there was a real comparison between the way that Trump has behaved so far and Clinton did. But then again, once impeachment hearings began, there was a complete transformation in Clinton's demeanor. And it lasted until the end and then a couple of months later. So that was a high point, both in terms, I think, of substance of his administration and his approval rating.
You know, Democrats have worried that starting impeachment, the process, could actually help President Trump in 2020. Is there anything from the Clinton impeachment that would actually support that concern?
Well, I think there's a misunderstanding about this. I think there is a concern on the part of Democrats that there'll be a backlash to this. And there was a backlash to the Starr report and to the kind of self-righteousness of the people who wanted impeachment. But the real reason that Clinton maintained those high ratings during impeachment was his performance in office. And then under incredible pressure, he was sort of setting the impeachment aside and focusing on his responsibilities. I think that's where the misunderstanding is, that there wasn't his approval rating was more because of his performance. Impeachment sort of ironically brought out the best in him. This was the high point of his performance in office.
It's so fascinating to hear you say that. You know, before you go, I just want to ask you, if you were to give President Trump some advice for navigating these waters based on the history and the research you have done, what would you tell him?
Well, I'm not in the business of giving advice to the president, but I think there is a lesson to be learned from Clinton, that he surmounted the impeachment by sort of ignoring it in a way. Everybody knew it was going on, but again, this kind of laser-like focus on the people's problems, the country's problems, served him extremely well.
Professor Patrick Maney, I'm so grateful you could join us to teach us a little bit about history and impeachment. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.